In the late 1070s, the Byzantine Empire, led by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, encountered significant difficulties both internally and externally. Following a significant loss at the Battle of Massacred in 1071, the empire ceded much of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks, rendering it vulnerable and mired in chaos. Meanwhile, Robert Guiscard, the Norman Duke of Apulia and Calabria, identified an opportunity to expand his influence into Byzantine territory. By 1071, Robert, alongside his brother Roger, had captured the last Byzantine stronghold in Italy, Bari. The following year, they conquered all of Sicily, thereby ending the Islamic Emirate of Sicily. In 1074, Byzantine Emperor Michael VII sent an envoy to Robert, proposing a marriage alliance, the hand of his son Constantine to Robert's daughter Helena. Guiscard accepted the offer and dispatched his daughter to Constantinople. However, in 1078, Michael was overthrown by Nicephorus Botaniates, which dashed Helena's prospects for the throne. This political upheaval provided Robert with a pretext to invade the Byzantine Empire, claiming his daughter had been mistreated. However, his intervention was delayed due to a revolt in Italy. Dissatisfied with the seasoned soldiers who had served in his army from the beginning, Robert Guiscard assembled a new force, indiscriminately recruiting men without regard to age or experience. From across Lombardy and Apulia, he gathered a motley group, including both old and young individuals who had never even imagined wielding a weapon. These pitiable recruits, now clad in breastplates and carrying shields, struggled to draw bows and often stumbled and fell when ordered to march. Anna Komnena vividly describes Robert's preparations for his new campaign, emphasizing the awkwardness and inexperience of his new troops. Throughout the autumn and winter, the fleet was refitted, the army expanded, though perhaps not as dramatically as Anna suggests, and re-equipped. Concurrently, Robert dispatched an ambassador to the Byzantine court with orders to demand better treatment for his daughter Helena and to win the favor of the domestic of the schools, Alexios. While the specific outcomes of these diplomatic efforts remain unknown, the ambassador was evidently charmed by Alexios. On his return journey to Italy, he learned of Alexios' successful coup against Botaniates, by which he became Alexios I Komnenos. Upon his return, the ambassador advised Robert to seek peace, asserting that Alexios desired only friendship with the Normans. However, Robert had no intention of making peace. He sent his son Bohemond ahead with an advance force towards Greece. Bohemond landed at Aulon, with Robert following shortly after. Robert Guiscard's expeditionary force was stationed at Brindisi and Otranto, magnificently equipped and ready to set sail, with one of the grandest prizes in Europe within his grasp. The impressive fleet embarked towards the end of May 1081, carrying around 1,300 Norman knights, supported by a substantial number of Saracens, some unreliable Greeks, and several thousand heterogeneous foot soldiers. At Avlona, the fleet was joined by a few Ragusan vessels. The Ragusans, like many Balkan peoples, were always eager for an opportunity to challenge the Byzantines. The combined fleet then proceeded slowly down the coast to Corfu, where the imperial garrison surrendered immediately. With this strategic position secured, ensuring the free passage of reinforcements from Italy, Robert Guiscard was ready to commence serious military operations. His first target was Dyrrhachium, the capital and chief port of Illyria. However, it soon became evident that progress would not be as straightforward as anticipated. As Robert's fleet navigated northward around the Acroceraunian Cape, an area traditionally avoided by the ancients due to its association with Jupiter Fulminans, who was believed to launch his thunderbolts from there, they were overtaken by a sudden tempest. Several ships were lost in the storm. When the battered remnants of the fleet finally anchored off Dyrrhachium, they saw a Venetian fleet approaching from the northwestern horizon. As soon as Alexios I Komnenos learned of Robert Guiscard's landing on imperial territory, he urgently appealed to Doge Domenico Selvo of Venice for assistance. This appeal was likely unnecessary, as the threat posed to Venice by Norman control of the Straits of Otranto was as significant as the threat to the Byzantine Empire. Nonetheless, Selvo did not hesitate. He took personal command of the Venetian war fleet and set sail immediately. As night fell, he bore down on the Norman ships. Robert's men fought tenaciously, but their lack of experience in naval warfare became apparent. The Venetians employed an old Byzantine tactic, first used by Belisarius at Palermo 5.5 centuries earlier, which involved hoisting manned dinghies to the yardarms, allowing soldiers to shoot down on the enemy below. Additionally, it appears they had mastered the use of Greek fire. According to the Norman chronicler Geoffrey Malaterra, the Venetians blew that fire, which is called Greek and is not extinguished by water, through submerged pipes, and thus cunningly burnt one of our ships under the very waves of the sea. Against such sophisticated tactics and formidable weapons, the Normans were powerless. Their line was shattered, and the Venetians managed to reach the safety of the harbor at Dyrrhachium. However, it took more than this setback to discourage the Duke of Apulia. Robert Guiscard's army, which he had prudently disembarked before the naval battle, remained intact, allowing him to commence the siege of Dyrrhachium. Emperor Alexios had sent his trusted ally, George Palaeologus, to command the local troops, instructing him to hold off the enemy at all costs while he raised an army to counter the invaders. The garrison, knowing that reinforcements were on the way, fought valiantly. The siege dragged on throughout the summer, marked by frequent sorties from the defenders. In one notable sortie, Palaeologus fought heroically all day, despite having a Norman arrowhead embedded in his skull. Meanwhile, Robert's camp was ravaged by disease. According to the contemporary historian Anna Komnena, up to 10,000 men died, including 500 knights. Despite these losses, the situation for the Dyrrhachium garrison became increasingly dire due to the effectiveness of Norman siege weapons. Learning of the garrison's plight while stationed in Salonika with his army, Alexios advanced with full force against the Normans. On the 15th of October, the Byzantine army arrived with the emperor himself at its head. According to Anna Komnena, Alexios commanded around 20,000 men. Historian John Halden estimates the army's size to be between 18,000 and 20,000 men, while John Birkenmeier suggests it was between 20,000 and 25,000 men. The army consisted of the Thracian and Macedonian Armada, numbering about 5,000 men, elite excubitors and bestiarity units comprising around 1,000 men, a force of Manichaeans numbering 2,800 men, Thessalian cavalry, Balkan conscripts, Armenian infantry, and other light troops. Additionally, the Byzantine forces were joined by 2,000 Turkish and 1,000 Frankish mercenaries, about 1,000 Varangians, and 7,000 Turkish auxiliaries sent by the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. To bolster his forces, Alexios withdrew the Tagmata from Heraclea Pontica and the remaining Byzantine holdings in Asia Minor, effectively abandoning them to be overrun by the Turks. He convened a war council and sought advice from his senior officers, including George Palaeologus, who had managed to sneak out of Dyrrhachium. A majority of the senior officers, including Palaeologus, urged caution, arguing that time was on the emperor's side. However, Alexios favored an immediate assault, hoping to catch Robert Guiscard's army from the rear while they were still besieging the city. Alexios then moved his army to the hills opposite Dyrrhachium, planning to launch an attack on the Normans the following day. Guiscard, however, had been alerted to Alexios' arrival by his scouts. On the night of October 17th, he repositioned his army from the peninsula to the mainland. On October 18th, both sides met on the battlefield. Guiscard took command of the center, his son Bohemond led the Norman left, and the seaward right flank was commanded by the Count of Giovinazzo, along with Guiscard's wife, the Lombard princess Sicily of Salerno. Alexios divided his army into 3 main divisions for the battle. The left wing was commanded by Gregory Pakourianos, the right wing by Nikephoros Melissenos, and Alexios himself led the center. The Varangians were positioned just ahead of the main line, supported by a strong division of archers stationed slightly behind them. The archers were instructed to advance in front of the Varangians, fire a volley of arrows, and then retreat behind them. This tactic of advancing, firing, and retreating was maintained by the archers until the army was close to making contact with the enemy. As was customary when Emperor Alexios I Komnenos personally led his forces, the Varangian Guard was present in considerable strength. This elite unit, largely composed of Englishmen who had fled their homeland after the Battle of Hastings, was driven by a deep-seated desire for revenge against the Normans. For 15 years, they had waited for this moment, their longing for retribution shaping their every move. As the armies drew closer, the air crackled with tension. Robert Guiscard, seeking to provoke the Varangians, dispatched a detachment of cavalry from his center to execute a feint. They charged forward, only to retreat hastily, hoping to lure the Varangians from their fortified position. However, the Byzantine archers unleashed a relentless volley of arrows, forcing the Norman cavalry to retreat without achieving their goal. Undeterred, Guiscard's forces on the right, led by Count Ami, launched a sudden and aggressive assault. They aimed their attack at the junction of the Roman center and left wing, targeting the vulnerable left flank of the Varangian line. The clash was fierce and immediate. Despite the ferocity of the assault, the Varangians held their ground with unwavering determination. Their massive two-handed battle axes swung with mighty force, cleaving through the ranks of the enemy. Each swing was a testament to their skill and rage, their axes a blur of death as they struck down horses and riders alike. The battlefield was a scene of turmoil and raw emotion. The Varangians, their armor stained and their axes heavy with the blood of their foes, stood as symbols of both vengeance and valor. The sight of these steadfast warriors, standing resolute in the face of overwhelming odds, struck terror into the hearts of the Apulian knights. The Normans, accustomed to overwhelming foot soldiers with their cavalry charges, found themselves unprepared for such an unyielding defense. The Varangians, whose faces were grim masks of vengeance, stood as an unbreakable wall against the Norman onslaught. Meanwhile, the Roman left wing, commanded by Gregory Pakourianos, surged forward with renewed vigor. This section of the army, composed of Alexios' best troops, pressed the advantage. Their advance was relentless and determined, breaking through the Norman lines and causing their formation to collapse. The once confident Norman ranks were now in disarray. Panic spread through the Norman forces as the realization of defeat set in. Many of the troops, consisting largely of conscripts and inexperienced cavalry, fled in terror toward the coast. Their retreat was a desperate scramble, and the chaotic scene was marked by cries of fear and confusion. As they fled, many were driven into the sea. Their attempts to escape turned into a deadly struggle against the waves. Yet, amid the chaos and retreat, a dramatic turn of events unfolded that would shift the momentum back in favor of the Normans. The pivotal moment was marked by the indomitable presence of Sicily, Robert Guiscard's wife. Riding beside her husband, Sicily, who was as revered for her courage as she was for her beauty, embodied the spirit of a warrior, As she witnessed the rout of the Norman troops and the sight of their retreating forms, her expression hardened with fierce resolve. In that critical moment, Sicylgida's voice rang out across the battlefield with a commanding authority. Drawing upon her own language, she uttered words of encouragement reminiscent of the stirring calls found in Homer's epics. "How far will you flee? Stand, and acquit yourselves like men." Her voice, powerful and unwavering, cut through the din of battle and reached the ears of the fleeing soldiers. The sight of their commanding presence and the sound of her fierce call had an electrifying effect. The fleeing troops, their courage faltering, were stirred by Sicylgida's unyielding resolve. Grasping a long spear with grim determination, Sicylgida spurred her horse into a full gallop, charging after the retreating soldiers. Her bold and relentless pursuit was not just an act of bravery, but a powerful symbol of leadership and defiance. As Sicylgida closed in on them, her presence and action reignited a spark of resolve within the retreating Normans. The sight of their fierce and resolute leader driving them onward was enough to pull them back from the brink of total rout. The fleeing soldiers, spurred by her example, regrouped and turned back toward the battlefield. With renewed determination, the Norman forces re-engaged in the fight. The battle, once seemingly lost, now saw a resurgence in Norman resistance. Sicylgida's intervention had breathed new life into the embattled forces, turning the tide once more and demonstrating the profound impact of leadership and courage in the heat of conflict. As the battle wore on, the Norman left wing and center engaged in fierce skirmishes with the Roman forces across the field. With the Norman right wing in disarray and their center, along with much of Guiscard's heavy cavalry, facing the threat of being outflanked, the Romans appeared to be gaining the upper hand. The chaos seemed to tilt towards a Byzantine victory. However, the tide shifted dramatically due to a critical misjudgment. The Varangians, driven by their fervor and the heat of pursuit, had become detached from Alexios's main line. Their focus on chasing the retreating Norman forces left them vulnerable. Exhausted from their relentless chase and burdened by their heavy armor, they were no longer in a position to effectively defend themselves. Seizing the opportunity, Guiscard dispatched a formidable force of Norman spearmen and crossbowmen to strike at the Varangians' exposed flank. The Varangians, unable to close in on the spearmen with their massive battle axes, found themselves caught in a precarious situation. Their once unassailable line was now vulnerable, and they could only fight in a confined space, unable to maneuver effectively. The Normans' attack was swift and decisive. The Varangians, who had been instrumental in holding back the Norman advance, were now trapped, their retreat cut off by the encroaching enemy. In a desperate bid to survive, the remaining Varangians sought refuge in a nearby chapel dedicated to the Archangel Michael. The sanctuary, once a symbol of protection, became their final refuge. But even in this moment of desperation, the Normans pressed their advantage. They set the chapel ablaze, turning the sanctuary into a fiery tomb. The Varangians, now faced with both the searing flames and the relentless attack, found themselves surrounded by destruction. The chapel's flames, fed by the intense heat and the wooden structure, claimed the lives of most of the Varangians who had taken shelter within. As the fire consumed the chapel, the last vestiges of the Varangian resistance were extinguished. The once indomitable force of the Varangians had been brought low by a combination of tactical oversight, exhaustion, and the ruthless efficiency of their adversaries. Their fiery end marked a tragic chapter in the battle, highlighting the harsh realities of medieval warfare and the cruel twists of fate that could turn the tide of conflict. In the heart of the tumultuous battlefield, the tide of conflict had dramatically shifted, with the Varangians, a stalwart force now decimated, no longer holding the line, and the Roman left wing still caught up in the pursuit of the retreating Norman right wing. The Byzantine forces found themselves in a precarious position. The once orderly ranks of Alexios I Komnenos' army were now vulnerable, their defenses compromised. The moment of reckoning came as Robert Guiscard's heavy cavalry, held in reserve for such an opportunity, surged into action. The Norman cavalry, now divided into smaller focused detachments, launched a series of devastating charges against the exposed Byzantine center. Their assault was relentless, crashing into Alexios' line with brutal efficiency. The infantry archers and skirmishers who had been positioned behind the Varangians were either overwhelmed or rendered ineffective by the chaos unfolding around them. The Roman right flank, along with the central battle line, was left to face the onslaught without the support of their heavy Varangian infantry. As the Norman cavalry's onslaught continued, the cohesion of Alexios' forces began to unravel. The well-disciplined Roman formations, once a formidable defensive barrier, were now disintegrating under the relentless pressure. In the midst of the chaos, Emperor Alexios fought valiantly, his personal courage shining through the turmoil. However, the Byzantine army had suffered devastating losses at massacred and had yet to recover, and the mercenaries who now made up the bulk of his forces lacked the discipline and dedication required to withstand the fierce Norman assault. The situation grew increasingly dire as George Palaeologus' sortie from Dyrrhachium failed to turn the tide. To compound the emperor's troubles, Alexios was betrayed by King Constantine Baden of Zeta and a regiment of 7,000 Turkish auxiliaries who had been lent to him by the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman. These allies, upon whom Alexios had placed great hope, now turned against him, sealing the fate of the Byzantine army. In the thick of the battle, Alexios witnessed the tragic loss of George's father, Nicephorus Palaeologus, and Michael VII's brother, Constantius. The weight of these personal losses added to the growing despair on the battlefield. Cut off from his men and with his forces in disarray, the emperor was forced to make a desperate decision. His once proud army was collapsing around him, and his last chance for victory was slipping away. The emperor and his retinue, weakened by exhaustion and the physical toll of the battle, fought as long as they could. But the relentless Norman assault made their position untenable. With a heavy heart and grim determination, Alexios was compelled to fall back. His escape was a desperate race against time, with the Normans pursuing him relentlessly. Wounded and weary, Alexios managed to evade capture and made his way back over the mountains to Ohrid. The journey was arduous, marked by pain from a forehead wound and the burden of defeat. Upon reaching Ohrid, Alexios sought to regroup and recover what remained of his shattered forces. Meanwhile, the imperial camp, once a symbol of Byzantine strength and opulence, was left defenseless. The victorious Normans, having driven the Byzantine forces from the field, seized the opportunity to plunder the camp and claim the rich spoils left behind. Alexios Komnenos, despite his proven tactical skills, was critically undermined by several key errors during the Battle of Dyrrhachium. His decision to pursue the retreating Norman wings, a violation of established Byzantine military principles, led to a disorganized and weakened front. This lapse in discipline allowed the Norman heavy cavalry to exploit gaps in the Byzantine lines, achieving breakthroughs with minimal resistance. In response to this experience, Alexios modified his strategies in future engagements. He sought to avoid direct clashes with heavy cavalry and instructed his archers to target the unarmored horses of enemy cavalry, aiming to neutralize their effectiveness. The defeat at Dyrrhachium had severe repercussions for the Byzantine Empire, which was already struggling with significant shortages of manpower and resources. The loss of approximately 5,000 troops, including a substantial portion of the Varangian Guard, left a considerable gap in the Byzantine military strength. While the exact number of Norman casualties remains uncertain, historian John Haldon suggests that they were significant. Following the battle, George Palaeologus, who had attempted a sortie from Dyrrhachium, was unable to re-enter Dyrrhachium and withdrew with the main Byzantine force. The defense of the citadel was subsequently managed by Venetian forces, while the city itself was overseen by the Count of the Tent, who mobilized from Arbanon. Despite Norman efforts, Dyrrhachium managed to resist for an additional 4 months. It was not until February 1082 that the Normans were able to breach the city gates, and this achievement was facilitated by treachery. Thus, while the battle and siege of Dyrrhachium marked a significant episode in the Byzantine-Norman conflict, it was far from the end of the broader war between these two powers.